Good morning, good afternoon, Trevitt. How are y'all doing today? Today we have a very special guest reader, Miss Tia Ramey. Woo! How you doing, Miss Ramey? How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. How are you?
I'm well. I want to thank you for taking time out your day to come read to the kids at Trevitt. Thank you so much. So can you share a little bit about yourself or tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my name is Tia Ramey, and I am a social media strategist. And so I do social media for a living. That's what I do. Is I get on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and try to create a voice for all the wonderful companies and public figures out there in the world who don't have time to run those pages for themselves.
Okay, so that's actually a career, correct?
Correct.
So what do you need to possibly get into that career? Because I know a lot of our kids use social media, and some of them might not actually think that's something they can do to get paid off of or actually create a business around. Can you tell us a little bit about that for our fourth and fifth grade entrepreneurs that we have?
Well, you have to be a very good writer. That's one thing I will say is very important to pay attention in all of your reading and writing classes. And it's really important to be very good at talking to people and improve your communication skills because most of what I do is just knowing how to say things that people want to hear.
Okay, it's good advice. Can I ask, do you have a degree in communications or public relations? Or I don't think
I,
I've asked that
yeah,
before.
well, I have a degree in fine arts actually, and so my focus and some of the things I studied was graphic design and advertising, and I also have a specialty in fashion design. So sometimes you have to pull from all the different classes that you had to build a career because at the time that I got into social media, it wasn't a career. A lot of us have had to create them, and sometimes your job doesn't exist yet. You've got to be ready to create a new one.
All right, thank you. That's good advice. I appreciate that. So I know you got a book for us today. What book are you reading to us?
Today I'm reading one of my favorite books I used to read to my daughter before she got too old for me. This book is called The Patchwork Quilt. It's by Valerie Flournoy.
All right, are y'all ready for it? The patch what?
The Patchwork Quilt.
Patchwork quilt. Y'all ready? All right,
Yay!
here we go.
All right. Tanya sat restlessly on her chair by the kitchen window. For several days she had gone to stay in bed with a cold. But now Tanya was almost gone. She was anxious to go outside and enjoy the fresh air and the arrival of the spring. Mama, when can I go outside? Asked Tanya. Mama pulled the tray of biscuits from the oven and placed it on the counter. In time, she murmured. All in good time. Tanya gazed through the window and saw her two brothers, Ted and Jim, and Papa building the new backyard fence. I'm going to talk to Grandma, she said, on these great pictures. Grandma was sitting in her favorite spot, the big soft chair in front of the picture window. In her lap were scraps of materials of all textures and colors. Tanya recognized some of them. The plaid was from Pawpaw's old sweatshirt, and the red scraps were from the shirt Ted had worn that winter. What you gonna do with that stuff? Tanya asked. Stuff? These ain't stuff. These little pieces gonna make me a quilt, a patchwork quilt. Tanya tilted her head. I know what a quilt is, Grandma. There's one on your bed, but it's old and dirty, and Mama can never get it clean. Grandma sighed. It ain't dirty, honey. It's worn, the way it's supposed to be. Grandma flexed her fingers to keep from stiffening. She sucked in some air and said, My grandmother made me a quilt when I wasn't any older than you, but sometimes the old ways are forgotten. Leaned against the chair and rested her head on her grandmother's shoulder. Just then, Mama walked in with two glasses of milk and some biscuits. Mama looked at the scraps of materials that were scattered all over. Grandma, she said, I just cleaned this room and now it's a mess. It's not a mess, Mama, Tanya said through a mouthful of biscuits. It's a quilt. A quilt? You don't need these scraps. I can get you a quilt, Mama said. Grandma looked at her daughter and then turned to her grandchild. Yes, your mama can get you a quilt, any department store, but it won't be like my patchwork quilt, and it won't last long either. Mama looked at Grandma, then picked up Tanya's empty glass and went to make a lunch. Grandma's eyes grew dark and distant. She turned away from Tanya and gazed out the window, absent-mindedly rubbing the pieces of material through her fingers. Grandma, I'll help you make a quilt, Tanya said. Thank you, honey. Let's start right now. We'll be finished in no time. Grandma held Tanya close and patted her head. It's going to take quite a while to make this quilt. Not a couple of days or a week, not even a month. A good quilt, a masterpiece. Grandma's eyes shone at the thought. Why, I need more material. More gold and blue, some red and green, and I'll need the time to do it right. It'll take me at least a year. A year? Tanya shouted. That's too long. I can't wait that long, Grandma. Grandma laughed. A year ain't that long, honey. Making this quilt going to be a joy. Now run along and let Grandma rest. Grandma turned her head toward the sunlight and closed her eyes. I'm going to make a masterpiece, she murmured, clutching a scrap of cloth in her hand just before she fell asleep. Well, I have to get you a new pair and use these old ones for rags, Mama said, as she hung the last piece of wash on the clothesline one August afternoon. Jim was miserable. His favorite blue corduroy pants had been held together with patches. Now they were beyond repair. Bring them there, Grandma said. Grandma took a big pant leg and cut a few blue squares. Jim gave her a hug and watched her add his patches to the others. A quilt won't forget. It can take your life story, she said. The arrival of autumn meant school and Halloween. This year, Tanya would be an African princess. She danced around in the long flowing robe, Mama said, and she had made her several yards of wonderful material. The old bracelets and earrings Tanya had found in the trunk in the attic jingled noisily as she moved. Grandma cut some squares off the leftover scraps and added Tanya to the quilt, too. Well, the days grew cold, but Tanya and her brothers didn't mind. They knew snow wasn't far away. Mama dreaded winter's coming every year, and she would plead with Grandma to move away from the drafty window. But Grandma wouldn't budge. Grandma, please, Mama scolded. You can sit here by the heater. I'm not your grandmother, I'm your mother, Grandma said. I'm going to sit here in the Lord's light and make my masterpiece. It was the end of November when Ted, Jim, and Tanya got their wish. They woke one morning to find everything in sight, covered with snow. Tanya got dressed and flew down the stairs. Ted and Jim and Eva, Mama, and Papa were already outside. I don't like leaving Grandma in the house by herself, Mama said. I know she's lonely. Tanya pulled herself out of the snow, being careful not to ruin her angel. Grandma isn't lonely, Tanya said. She and her quilt are telling each other stories. Mama glanced questioningly at Tanya. Telling each other stories? Yes. Grandma says a quilt never forgets. The family spent the morning and most of the afternoon sledding down the hill. Finally, when they were all numb from the cold, they went inside for hot chocolate and sandwiches. I think I'll go sit down and talk to Grandma, Mama said. Then she can explain to you about the quilt. Our very own family quilt, Tanya said. Mama saw the mischievous glint in her youngest child's eyes. Why, I may just have to do that, young lady, Mama said as she walked out of the kitchen. Tanya leaned over the table to see into the living room. Grandma was hunched over, her eyes close to the fabric as she made tiny stitches. Mama sat down at the old woman's feet. Tanya couldn't hear what was said, but she knew Grandma was telling Mama all about quilts and how this quilt would be very special. Tanya sipped her hot chocolate slowly, and then she saw Mama pick up a piece of fabric, rub it between her fingers, and smile. From that moment, both women spent their winter evenings working on the quilt. Mama did the sewing while Grandma cut the fabric and placed the scraps in a pattern of colors, even while they were cooking and baking all their Christmas specialties during the day. At night, they still worked on the quilt. Only once did Mama put it aside. She wanted to wear something special Christmas night. So she brought some gold material and made a beautiful dress. Tanya knew without asking that the scraps would be in the quilt too. There was much singing and laughing that Christmas. All Grandma's sons and daughters and nieces and nephews came to pay their respects. The Christmas tree lights shone brightly, filling the room with sparkling colors. Later, when everyone had gone, Papa said he had never forgot or felt so much happiness in the house, and Mama agreed. When Tanya got downstairs the next morning, she found Papa fixing pancakes. Is today a special day too? Jim asked. Where's Mama? Asked Tanya. Grandma doesn't feel well this morning, Papa said. Your mother is with her now, till the doctor gets here. Will Grandma be all right? Ted asked. Papa rubbed his son's head and smiled. There's nothing for you to worry about. We'll take care of Grandma. Tanya looked into the living room. There on the back of the big chair rested the patchwork quilt. It was folded neatly, just as Grandma had left it. Mother didn't want us to know she wasn't feeling well. She thought it would spoil our Christmas. Mama told them later. Her face drawn and tired, her eyes puffy and red. Now it's up to all of us to be quiet and make her as comfortable as possible, Papa said. He put an arm around Mama's shoulder. Can we see Grandma? Tanya asked. No, not tonight, Papa said. Grandma needs plenty of rest. It was nearly a week, the day before New Year's Eve, before the children were permitted to see their grandmother. She looked tired and spoke in whispers. We miss you, Grandma, Ted said, and your muffins and hot chocolate, added Jim. Grandma smiled. Your quilt misses you too, Grandma, Tanya said. Grandma's smile faded from her lips. Her eyes grew cloudy. My masterpiece, Grandma sighed. It would have been beautiful, almost half finished. The old woman closed her eyes and turned away from her grandchildren. Papa whispered it was time to leave. Ted, Jim, and Tanya crept from the room. Tanya walked slowly to where the quilt lay. She had seen Grandma and Mama work on it. Tanya thought real hard. She knew how to cut the scraps, but she wasn't sure of the rest. Just then, Tanya felt a hand resting on her shoulder. She looked up and saw Mama. Tomorrow, Mama said. New Year's Day was the beginning. After the dishes were washed and put away, Tanya and Mama examined the quilt. You cut more squares, Tanya, while I stitched some patches together, Mama said. Tanya snipped and trimmed the scraps of material till her hands hurt from the scissors. Mama watched her carefully, making sure the squares were all the same size. The next day was the same at last. More snipping and cutting, but Mama couldn't always be around to watch Tanya work. Grandma had to be looked after, so Tanya worked by herself. Then one night, as Papa read the stories, Jim walked over and looked at the quilt. In it, he saw patches of blue, his blue. Without saying a word, Jim picked up the scissors and some scraps and started to make squares. Ted helped Jim put the squares in piles while Mama showed Tanya how to join them. Every day, as soon as she got home from school, Tanya worked on the quilt. Ted and Jim were too busy with sports, and Mama was looking after Grandma, so Tanya worked alone. But after a few weeks, she stopped. Something was wrong. Something was missing, Tanya thought. For days, the quilt lay on the back of the chair. No one knew why Tanya had stopped working. Tanya would sit and look at the quilt. Finally, she knew something wasn't missing. Someone was missing from the quilt. That evening, before she went to bed, Tanya tiptoed into Grandma's room, a pair of scissors in her hand. She quietly lifted the end of Grandma's old quilt and carefully removed a few squares. February and March came and went as Mama proudly watched her daughter work on the last few rows of patches. Tanya always found time for the quilt. Grandma had been watching too. The old woman had been getting stronger and stronger as the months passed. When she was able, Papa would carry Grandma to the chair by the window. I need the Lord's light, Grandma said. Then she would sit and hum softly to herself and watch Tanya work. Yes, honey, this quilt is nothing but a joy, Grandma said. Summer vacation was almost here. One June day, Tanya came home to find Grandma working on the quilt again. She had finished sewing the last few squares together. The stuffing was in place and she already had pinned on the backing. Grandma! Tanya shouted. Grandma looked up. Hush, child. It's almost time to do the finishing on these patches. But first, I have some special finishing touches. The next night, Grandma cut the final thread with her teeth. There, it's done, she said. Mama helped Grandma spread the quilt full length. Nobody had realized how big it had gotten, or beautiful. Reds, blues, greens, golds, light shades, and dark, blended in and out throughout the quilt. It's beautiful, Papa said. He touched the gold patch, looked at Mama, and remembered. Jim remembered too. There was his blue and red from Ted's shirt. There was Tanya's Halloween costume, and there was Grandma. Even though her patch was old, it fit right in. They all remembered the past year. They especially remembered Tanya and all her work. So it had been decided. In the right-hand corner of the last row of patches was delicately stitched, "For Tanya, from your mama and grandma." See? The end. I hope you enjoyed.
That was a great book, and you read that wonderfully. Like I was like, man, she got a great teacher reading voice. I love the story because it's family oriented, and it reminded me of my grandmother. My grandma actually used to make quilts, and I actually got one of her quilts. I was gonna run in real quick and get it. I was like, nah, I'll show it to the class later. But I love it because all the family was spending time making this quilt, and that's something that that little girl probably will hold on to for the rest of her life. You know, even when she's a kid, and pass it down, or even make it with her family. So, I mean, what did you get out of the book?
I love this book, and I'm a huge family person. I used to read this to my daughter all the time. And what I like about it is that generational wisdom that helps you to slow down and appreciate small moments for the sake of the bigger picture. And it reminded my grandmother didn't make quilts, but my grandmother, she loved to crochet, and she taught me how to do that. And I went to design school, fashion school, so that was my introduction into handling materials, having those sort of skills passed down to me that really made room for other things I got into in my life. So I really appreciated this book and the family lessons and the contributions and the just the moments and time that it really takes to build quality experiences.
Yes, yes. And if you want to be a fashion designer, that's a good way to start building quilts, making that family time. Do you have any words of advice for our kids before we wrap up?
I would definitely say to just um, don't take any lessons for granted. Every conversation that you have with someone that cares about you and wants the best for you, just like Mr. Carey, it matters. And you never know how it's going to show up later in life, but it does matter and it's doing good things. And so, as you're taking in wonderful words to help you be a better person, make sure that you also give wonderful words as well. So, it's very important that we are building a beautiful planet that enables each other to empower each other and to show love to each other and support each other. We all have a part in that, no matter how small you are.
Yes, ma'am. I appreciate those words of advice. Take heed, words of affirmation. We talked about that. So I want to thank you, Miss Ramey, for coming and reading to our kids and spreading your knowledge on us. Thank you so much. Everybody say bye.
Bye. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You're awesome.